I'm in the middle of researching a book on adoption, and it's taken me into the world of illegitimacy because they're both deeply entwined. And I have to say that I'm completely new to this subject because, believe it or not, I don't have any records of having dealt with, in my practice, with either an adopted child or an adopting parent. And that is a question that I found myself asking myself all the way through. I think that one way I'm coming at this is to say that I think there has been a reluctance in society, and certainly within my psychoanalytic training, there wasn't such a subject of adoption or illegitimacy on my reading list. And I think there is something that still we need to talk about and discuss, which is really what I'm doing in this paper. So when I started out on this journey, as I say, I only had a friend who had been adopted, and she's my age, so she was adopted just at the beginning of the war, when you couldn't know who your adopted parents, your original parents were. It was closed, it was sealed off. So she was brought up never to ask questions about her own childhood beginnings. And she's insisted, because I've kept up with her, that she's never told her children that she was an adopted child, and they're just beginning to come to me and say, what do we do about this? And so then I began to be really interested as to what is it that's made it so difficult certainly for me in my practice, to think about adoption, for us as psychotherapists to think about adoption and illegitimacy. And I think because my first degree was in sociology, I've always been interested in how things come to be the way they are. What is the history of our thinking? And as I began to think more about illegitimacy, it seemed to become clear that really it was at the Reformation, at the collapse of the feudal system, that the idea of illegitimacy became such a difficult subject. I have a slightly sort of idealized notion of the feudal estate with the illegitimate children running around on the farm as useful hands on the land from a very early age. But there are no records prior to the 15th century of illegitimacy being recorded in churches. So what began to happen as the feudal estate broke up, more and more people turned to the towns for jobs and found themselves, of course, often unable to find jobs. And one of the very early nursery rhymes that we were brought up on, hark, hark the dogs do bark, the beggars are coming to town, was a reflection of this period of the enormous number of people traversing the roads as they walked, trying to find jobs. And one of the things that began to happen was that young girls who had a child illegitimately were seen to be at the bottom of the heap. There was a very nice way in which things were structured between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Because when the first poor law came in 1573, you began to get, as we now have with universal credit, the idea of structuring who are the deserving and who are the undeserving. And at the bottom of the pile became the undeserving young woman with a baby. And under no circumstances should the baby be allowed any care. It was preferable if they should die. And one of the terms that was important to try and distinguish who these babies were that should be got rid of, they were called a bastard. And there's rather a nice etymology of the word bastard. And it, in medieval times, the travelling salesman went around with his pack horse and his big bag, which was called a bastardus. Inevitably, he left a child or two behind in the village where he'd been selling his goods, and the child he left behind was called a bastard. And already you begin to see there the notion that the man can get away with it, he just goes off on his travels, and the poor girl and the baby are left managing as best they could. And by the 18th century, laws were beginning to be formulated about how we should think about the bastard. In the 18th century, legislation was brought in which a bastard should be called a filius nullius. And that meant it was the child of nobody, or, in a more refined way, the child of no man. And in this way, you can see men managed to escape any responsibility, and it was left to the woman. I'm not going to go into it now, but I do bring it out in my book because it's really quite interesting to see the double thinking at the time, because though the child of this man was a child of no man, the child was a child of a woman, and she had to take some responsibility for the child. At the same time, if she was married, she had no responsibility. She was her husband's possession. So there was a lot of difficult thinking around how the poor bastard should be treated. And it's extremely painful to go back and read some of the social history of the time. And one of the books I've much relied upon is this wonderful book by Jenny Keating called A Child for Keeps, if anybody is interested. I think it's a beautifully researched book, and I've relied a lot on it. The Poor Law Act of 1572 brought together the idea of poverty and God's law with the idea that the bastard was an offence against God and man, and no relief should be given to them, lest it should encourage a lewd life in the woman who had had the child. And as late as 1927, a Dr. Lister wrote, "There is an attitude of mind amongst supposedly Christian people who seem to regard the high death rate amongst illegitimate babies as an indication of divine displeasure, which caused them to be born with a predisposition to death." And that was a quite proper state of things. So this is 1927. It was considered to be a miracle if an illegitimate child lived for more than a year. And there's a most wonderful account of this miracle child who'd lived to the age of 5. You know, even when the Foundling Hospital was started by Coram and opened in 1756, the death rate, 80% of the babies that were brought to him died within the first weeks of life. And he had to resort to wet nursing and sending the babies out to the country in a way to give them some chance of living. there was something also beginning to happen in the 18th century and 19th century. If you begin to look at literature, and, well, if you even look at Shakespeare, it was as though suddenly the nation was beginning to wake up and think, well, actually, the whole notion of adoption and illegitimacy is a pretty good subject for novels. And you've got Tom Jones by Fielding. You've got 3 great novels, or two novels and a good short story by George Eliot, Silas Marner, Felix Holt, Daniel Deronda. And then you've got Dickens with Oliver Twist. So you're beginning to see that people are beginning to think it's a good story, even if they're not doing much about it. But actually, George Eliot was very interested in the whole debate about whether one of the things that made the illegitimate child so unfortunate was that it had bad blood. And I don't go into it here in this talk, but the notion of bad blood links back to a pre-medieval Serranus belief that blood and semen were the same thing, so that the semen, the blood of the upright man, was the thing that determines its good blood.